Give me the basics of PowerShell. Okay, calm down. We're going to go over just the basics so you can get a really good grasp of just what PowerShell is, what it's used for. We'll go through some examples. We'll walk through some of those examples, and that's it. That's all we're going to do. So let's go. Okay, to get started with the basics here, if you hit on your search bar on the bottom here or your start button and just start typing the word PowerShell, you'll see one of the apps come up. It's just called Windows PowerShell. So if you select that, you'll be met with a window similar to this. It'll look different on different versions of Windows. I'm on the latest version of Windows 11, so mine might look a little bit different than everybody else's. Anyway, so you're met with the command line shell of PowerShell. So this application is referred to as a command line shell, but we're going to use the language of PowerShell to interact with the application here. So what I'm going to start with is a really basic command here that says write host hello. And you can see what's come out on the other end here is just the word hello. So what we have here with write-host is what we call a commandlet. A commandlet is basically just the action that you're telling PowerShell to perform. So in this case, we're telling it to write to the host, and then we're providing it some input to write to the host. In this case, the string of hello. And that's what we have here on the end. One really big thing to understand here is the format of the commandlet. It's going to be a verb in front. The first word's going to be a verb, a dash, and then a noun. So that is going to be true with pretty much every single PowerShell commandlet that is out there. They should all conform to that standard. And it makes it really easy to understand what you're asking PowerShell to do. So now that we understand the format of the commandlets, let's go a little bit further into them. So what we had done was write host hello. So this hello is an input parameter for the write host commandlet. And in fact, what this actually is the same thing as this dash object. So the commandlet write host needs some parameters. It needs some type of input in order to do its job of writing to the host. How can it write to the host if it doesn't know what to write to the host? So we're telling it, okay, write host, and the object that you're going to write to the host is this string called hello. Now, commandlets always have parameters because they have to know what object to act on. And most commandlets have a ton of parameters. Write host has another parameter here called foreground color. And we can say yellow. And now we can see our output has turned yellow. We can change that to green. And now we can see our output is green. So this is what a parameter is. A parameter is just the extra input or extra direction that you're providing to the commandlet so it knows how to handle what it's supposed to do. Okay, so variables. Variables are used heavily in PowerShell. So let's get a really basic understanding of them and like how they work. So a variable in PowerShell is prepended with a $sign. All right, let's do name equals Dan. There we go. So PowerShell, while you can specify like a variable type, like a string or an int or whatever type you want, you don't have to. PowerShell kind of just figures it out based on the input. So if I tell it Dan here, it kind of knows that's a string variable because it's between the quotes like that. So to verify that, what we can do is I can take the variable and I'm going to do a function on it here called getType. We don't have to worry about this until later on. So we can see that the name is a string. It's basically representative of what type of variable it is. Okay, so now that we know how to set a variable, let's look at how we can display that variable. So before we were using write host, and we were saying write host hello, I think is what we were doing. So write host hello, there we go. Okay, so we've also done name equals Dan. So now if I go to write host, oops. If I do write host and I say name and hit enter, it takes the data from that variable, and then that's what it's writing. It's writing that data from that variable. We can do a little bit. We can also do a little bit more here with double quotes. So if I want to do something like this, say I'm writing a script or something, I want some output, but I also want to provide myself more information about the data that I'm pulling back and writing to the host. I can do something like this where in quotes I'm saying, okay, this is the string that I want to come back. Let's say I got 10 of these objects and I'm going to write them all. I can say, name, colon, and then the variable name, so that I could have name Dan, name Ted, name Eric. So I can create a string with these double quotes, and then I can put my variable in that string just like this. And PowerShell will take that string, will take the data from the name variable, put it in that string, and then write the whole thing out, which is what we can see here. Name, colon, Dan, semicolon, whatever it is. I always get those two mixed up. Anyway, so what if we wanted to actually write the variable called name and not the data inside it? So if we wanted to do, let's see, the variable name is name. So PowerShell took that variable data and it put it in my string. But in this case, I wanted just to write out the name of the variable that I'm using. So that's where single quotes come into action. So if we do that again, the variable name is name. So here's a big difference in PowerShell. Single quotes versus double quotes. Single quotes will take literally what's between those single quotes, but double quotes will act differently. Any variable that's in those double quotes, the data from that's being held in that variable is what will be pumped into the string. So we can see in the first example here with double quotes, the variable name is, and then there's an actual variable. So since it's in double quotes, PowerShell says, okay, what's the data that's in this variable? So we know that data is Dan. So it takes that data, takes Dan, and it replaces the variable name with its data, Dan. And we get the variable name is Dan. But the bottom example, the variable name is name in single quotes, just takes that literal content between those single quotes, and that's what it's writing in this case. And we can even kind of see that in PowerShell. You can see this double quote up here, the variable's in green, where the variable in the single quotes is not. Okay, for the next example here, we're going to look at a different commandlet that's very popular called get content. So you can kind of already assume what it's going to do, right? Based on that verb noun format, it's going to get something for us. What's it going to get? It's going to get content. So if it's going to get content, what are some of the parameters going to be? Well, it's got to know what content to get. So one of the parameters for that is called path. This tells PowerShell where to go to get content. So in this case, I've created a file here in a folder called c/temp, and the file is just called file.txt. If I pop it open in Notepad here, you'll see that here is my content, is the content that's in file.txt. And that's what we want to get out of it. So we got a file, we got some data in it, we want to get that out of there. We want to know what's inside of it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do get content, and our first parameter is path, and we're providing it the path, or the file path, to our text file that we want to get content from. So if I enter here, here's my content is returned to me. Now, if we wanted to take that data and put it into a variable, we can do something like this. Data equals get content path temp file.txt. And now you don't see any output like in the first line. And that's because our output was placed in that data variable rather than just written to the PowerShell host. So now if I just type data, I get the value of that variable, which in this case is here is my content. One thing to note with get content for the path parameter is there are going to be times when you'll have spaces in the file path. So if it was like temp files slash, file.txt or something like that, you'll get an error because there's a space in there that PowerShell thinks you're entering two separate things rather than just one file path. It thinks the path is ctemp and then files/file.txt is something else. So for file paths that have a space in them, just put it in single quotes. Now I get a different error here because that file path doesn't exist for me, but you can see that it accepted it properly because it's looking to go to that location and see if a file exists in there. So another very common use case for variables, get content, and a lot of other commandlets is defining a file path in a variable. So if I do something like this, file path equals file path equals ctemp/file.txt and hit enter. Now I've placed the path to my file in this file path variable. So if I start using get content, I no longer have to write out c/temp/file.txt. I can just put in file path. And there we go. So if you're interacting with a file a ton in like a script you're creating or something like that, and you have to put in a file path all the time, it's usually best to just take a variable, create a variable to hold that file path and then use that file path at those places in your script. So that way, if the file path changes in your script, you only have to update it here at the top where you're setting this variable and not 60 different spots in your script. Okay, another very popular commandlet to use is test path. So again, here we go with the verb noun format, kind of giving you an idea of what that commandlet's supposed to do. So it's going to test some path. It's going to see if it exists. So in this case, let's try our c/temp. There we go. Our parameter was -path, and then c/temp was our was the actual path. And in this case, PowerShell tested to see if that path exists, and it comes back with a true or false. So there are a lot of times when you're writing scripts, you want to see if something exists first before you either create it or overwrite it or delete it. So test path is used very often to see if something exists first before you make some sort of action happen. And files and folders aren't the only use case for test path. You can also see if a registry key exists. So very oftenly used in that case as well. Okay, for this next commandlet, I've created copies of our file.txt here because we're going to use an extremely popular commandlet called getChildItem. So getChildItem basically looks at a location or a file path and sees what items are held within it. So in this case, we're going to do getChildItem, and we're going to provide the path of ctemp. And if I hit enter here, we can see that the results returned are all of the files that I created in this location. It will even return us folders. Let's say I make a new folder here, and when I rerun it, we can see new folder also is returned. So one of the popular parameters to be used here is just -file. And basically that's telling the commandlet getChildItem, just look for files, not folders or any other objects. Just look for files in this location. So if I hit that, I'm just going to get my files that I had created. I'm not going to get the folders. Also, the same with -directory. That's going to give us our folder and not any of our files that are held within it. Additionally, if I had, well, let's go back here. I'm going to copy these 2 files and I'm going to put them in folder. Now, what's going to happen if I just do get child item path ctemp? I only get the items that are explicitly in that location. I don't get anything else that's under new folder. I don't get these items here. But what if I wanted all the child items in all the folders that are in this location? Well, I can use a parameter called recurse. Recurse. So if I hit recurse, it's going to go through any of the folders that I've provided, it's going to go through any folders that reside under path, and it's going to, for each of them, return the files that are held in it. So you can see here the results are ctemp, and it's given us our new folder and then all the files. And then the recurse parameter tells it to now go into new folder and see what contents are in there. So this has pulled back those files. So recurse will go through every folder that is within our original path. All right, so by this point, you may be asking yourself, well, Dan, how am I supposed to know the parameters that are available to me for any given commandlet? And that's a great question. And there's 2 big ways to really know them. One is if you, let's use our get child item here. One is if you type $? And hit enter, PowerShell is going to give you all the parameters that could be used with that commandlet. But that's one way that you can pull the parameters that are used for commandlet. You can also see what are called aliases. Aliases is another way to type get child item. So a GCI is a common alias for get child item. Also, the very old ls or ders that are used in like the CMD window are still interpreted here as aliases within PowerShell, so they could still be used, but it's better to just get in the habit of using the commandlet outright, so get child item rather than the aliases here. The second way is to use the internet. What I will do is just search for my commandlet, and almost always the top result you're going to get is a Microsoft Learn article about the commandlet. So if I click that, it's going to give me the syntax, all the different parameters that can be used, and usually a lot of examples as well. So we can see an example here for getting child items from a file system directory. So this is what we did earlier, right? Get child item path c/test, and here's the results. But a lot of times you're going to get a lot of examples. Get child item names in a directory. So if you just want the names, you can grab those. Here's where we have an example of recurse being used and a wildcard of just, the wildcard in this case is just the asterisk. So get anything in ctest that is a txt file or that ends in txt. And any of its subfolders or subdirectories, go through those too and get me some of the results that might show up. But you can see there's tons of different examples here for get child item. Like I said, very popular commandlet. And you'll even see if you go further down, information about the parameters as well. So a really good way to understand what parameters are out there and available to you for every single commandlet that is there. Now, another really cool tool when you're first learning PowerShell is PowerShell ISE, which stands for Integrated Scripting Environment. This is also on every Windows computer, every recent version of Windows. And if you pop it open, you'll get a window just like this. On the bottom, we can see our PowerShell window like we had open earlier. On the top, this is our scripting area. This is where we can write our commands, like write host, hello. And we have a play button up here to execute or run our script. So basically it takes everything that we put in the top portion, it plops it down into PowerShell on the bottom and runs it. And on the right side here, we have a ton of commandlets that are available to us that if we want to reference them, we can. So we can click on them and show details to learn more information about them. I'm just going to close this because it seems to take a while. But I'm just going to close that out, but you could reference it. But one of the things that is super awesome about PowerShell ISE is IntelliSense. IntelliSense kind of tries to figure out what you're attempting to do and provides you options. So if I start writing let's say I'm going to write the commandlet write host, and I start typing write and then hit dash. It's going to give me all the commandlets that start with write dash. So we can see write host. We can also see a similar commandlet called write output. Write progress. If we want progress in a job that we're doing, we can create our own little progress bar. Write errors, write event log, write debug. Like these are all the commandlets that start with write. So I can choose write host. And then if I go here to type my first parameter, I just type dash. I get all the parameters that are available to a commandlet. This is super awesome. So let's go back to our get child item example. There are a ton of parameters for get child item. So if I start dash here, I got path, literal path, include, exclude, recurse, the name. I get directory, I get file. So ISE is an amazing tool to really get you started with PowerShell because it's going to fill in some of those gaps where maybe you think, oh, I can't remember what parameter to use. I can't remember what's available to me. I can go to the Microsoft Learn site for the commandlet and take a look at them. But it's so much easier if I can just start typing and have PowerShell ISE provide me the options. So really great tool and highly, highly recommended when you're first starting with PowerShell. I would, after you've played with PowerShell a little bit, I'd probably start recommending Visual Studio Code to be used for PowerShell. Very, very powerful. It has really, really cool integrations with a lot of different services and things that it can interact with. It has IntelliSense as well, along with a ton of other really cool things. But ISE is very basic and easy to use and understand. So that's usually why I recommend it first. And then migrate to VS Code once you get a little bit more hands-on with PowerShell. Okay, so next we're going to write a script with all the things that we've learned so far, and then we'll see how that works. Okay, so here we have our script that contains several of the items that we've already talked about, a few different commandlets, and it's got something new. Well, actually a couple new things. The first of which is comments. So comments are a way for you to put some information about your code in your code. It's not anything that gets run by PowerShell. It's just kind of notes in your code that are for other humans to read. So that is what you see in the first line item here, and it's denoted in PowerShell by a hashtag or a £, depending on how old you are. And you can see here that I put get all files in file path and write them to the host. So that's me just providing some information about the script that you are looking at. So then in the next line item, we're doing a clear host, which is a commandlet that just cleans everything out of PowerShell. So if I had some stuff down here in the PowerShell window, it would just clear it out. So we can start fresh. You can see we're setting the variable file path to ctemp. We're setting the color to green. And then we are writing to the host starting script with our foreground color of color, which is green. Then we see something we haven't looked at yet, which is an if statement. Pretty much every coding language, programming language has if statements. Basically, if something is true or accurate, run this code, and then if not, then run some other code. In our case, we're using that test path commandlet to see if file path, which is ctemp, exists. And if it does, then we're going to run some code here. And if it doesn't, we're going to run some other code. So in our case, we know test path exists. So we're going to do a write host, file path found, scanning for child items. And then we're going to have a new variable here called files. And the data that's going to reside in files is going to be what comes back from running this next commandlet here, which is get child item ctemp. Then we're using the recurse parameter to look for any folder, look inside of any folders that are in ctemp as well. And we're just looking for files. We got that dash file parameter. And then once that's done, we're going to write to our host files found, and we're going to put our files the content or the data that resides in our files variable and foreground color of green. And then if for some reason file path didn't exist, then we would write to the host that file path is not found in foreground color of red. So the expectation here is, because we know ctemp exists, we should get into this line of code and we should get this as our result that we're looking for, which is that it's going to write, PowerShell is going to write the file names to our host here. So if I click start, we'll see that's pretty much what we get. Scanning for child items. Oh, I didn't put a foreground color in there. Foreground color of color. Let's run it again. So our script starts. It says ctemp is found, scanning for child items, and then we get our files found. In this case, it's kind of ugly because we have a lot of copies and things sitting here, so it's not really formed in an easily readable way. So let's change that. Let's use something called a for each loop. So what this is going to do is going to say, for each of the objects that is inside of files, we're going to do something to each of them. So in our case, we're going to write to our host the file, and let's do a foreground color of color again. And so for each file that gets found by this get child item command, we're getting like 7 files. There's like 7 files in there. So for each one of them, it's going to run this command, and it's going to say, for this file, write it. For the next file, write it. For the third file, write it, and so on and so forth. So if we click play again here, this is what we're going to see. So this has changed a little bit. So now our file, our first command that got run with the write host was in kind of a weird format, hard to read. But now with our for each, we can see that it's in a much easier format here for us to read. It wrote the file name, and then it went to the next line and then wrote the file name. So that's a for each loop. For each item that is inside of a group of items. Or actually, I want to use the term objects because that's used in PowerShell a lot. So for each object that is in files, we're going to do something to it. All right, so that's a lot of the basics of PowerShell, a lot of the common commandlets that you might see out there and you might use. There are an endless number of commandlets that are out there. If you want to go further with PowerShell, I would definitely suggest taking a look at Microsoft Learn. I'll drop a couple links in the description below for you to check out. But just know that PowerShell is really powerful. If you're a system administrator, a system engineer, or you're just getting into those things, maybe you work in service desk or something like that, or you're just somebody who plays around in a home lab. PowerShell is super, super powerful. It can do so many things. It works on Mac, it works on Linux. You can interact with services that are everywhere in Azure, in Google Cloud, in AWS. So also check out my website, thecloudsquad.com. I post PowerShell tips on there every Tuesday, and you can learn from those as well. But I hope this was helpful, and see you around.